Well, welcome back to the Steve Mags Muscle Car Show podcast. We are now sponsored by High Octane Classics, the Northeast's largest muscle car and supercar dealership located at 143rd Washington Street in Auburn, Massachusetts, also known as 143 Washington Street in Auburn, Mass. High Octane Classics buys and sells and services muscle cars and exotics. You can call them at 508-859 4515. Hey, this is Steve Magnanti, also known as Steve Mags, host of Roadkill's Junkyard Gold, and for 15 years, one of the on-stage hosts for the Barrett Jackson Collector Car Auctions. You're tuned in to the Steve Mags Muscle Car Show. On this episode, we'll explore Muncie transmission terminology, how to tell a 348 Chevy block from a 409 block, how Chevrolet solved Camaro axle hop problems, and a whole lot more. Let's get it started. Okay, let's get started with fact number 50 from my Steve Magnanti's 1001 Muscle Car Facts. This is a Chevrolet chapter with engine and drivetrain themed factoids. Number 50 reads, small block 283 and 327s V8s destined for factory or over-the-counter kit installation in 1962 through 67 Chevy 2s and Novas had a special block casting which repositioned the oil filter mounting pad 2 inches higher. These blocks bear specific casting numbers that read, get ready, 3862194 for the 283, or for the 283, or 3790721, or 3791362, or 3791363 for 283 and 327 applications. Factory-sourced Chevy 2 fuel pumps, fuel lines, exhaust manifolds, and oil pans also differ from items used in larger passenger car applications. Now, this is a podcast, so I can't show you, but if you see one of these Chevy 2 specific or Chevy Nova specific engine blocks, the oil filter pad sits deeper in the oil pan rail by about 2 inches versus roughly an inch or so for Chevy Corvette or Impala or even truck applications. So at the swap meet, you'll often pay dearly for an original Chevy Nova engine block from 1965 or 66. And again, remember, on an earlier show, we teased the fact that Chevrolet offered in 1962 and 3 a V8 conversion kit for Chevy 2s. Before they actually launched the V8 option in 1964, late 64, in 62 and 3, they actually sold you a kit. And that kit would come with this very special engine block with one of those 4 block casting numbers. So it's a fascinating and complicated world, that world of Chevy engine block casting numbers. Okay, fact number 51, moving on. Let's move on to more Chevy Nova trivia. Okay, Detroit often assigned code names to new car development programs. Work on new for 1962 Chevy 2 began in the summer of 1960 and was referred to internally as Car H. A new engine program was started at the same time to replace the ancient inline 6 and resulted in the new inline 153 cubic inch 4-cylinder and 194 cubic inch inline 6 that powered the 1962 Chevy 2 Nova Compact. Leaked memos describing them as the L4 and L6 fooled some observers into believing the new engines used obsolete flathead side valve technology. It was not to be, as both engines were modern overhead valve designs. The inline 4 was Chevy's first since 1928 model year and was produced between 1962 and 1970. It's true, a lot of folks forget totally the fact that you could buy a 1962 through 1970 Chevy Nova or Chevy 2 with an inline 4-cylinder engine. In fact, those engines were also popularly used in Mercury outboard power systems for inboard-outboard boats. But if you bought a Chevy 2, the cheapest one on the lot, it probably had a 4-banger in it. And of course, that 194 cubic inch inline 6 would grow to 230 cubic inches and 250 cubic inches as the 60s progressed. But yeah, the inline 6-cylinder engines probably were installed in, I'd say 70% of all Chevy Novas through 1962 through 70. After all, the car was an economy model. V8 models and 4-cylinder models were actually pretty rare. Okay, moving on. Fact number 52. Let's talk truck. Moving on from Novas to trucks. Okay, when a suitable rear-wheel drive platform isn't available or practical, Detroit performance engineers have been known to base high-performance offerings on light-duty pickup trucks. The 1978 and 79 Dodge Little Red Express and 1993 up Ford Lightning hot haulers are prime examples. But unlike the small block 360 and 351 offerings from the competition, Chevrolet's 1990 through 1993 SS 454 pickup truck packed a burly big block mill from the get-go. First-year SS 454s came with the venerable turbohydromatic 400 3-speed automatic transmission and restrictive single exhaust systems. For 1991, the superior 4L80E 4-speed overdrive automatic arrived, as did a true dual exhaust system. These goodies delivered best of both worlds, gains on highway fuel economy and improved performance by 10%, horsepower jumping from 230 to 255 horsepower. I remember back in 1990, I was probably about 40 years old, something like that, and when the SS 454 Chevy pickup trucks arrived on the scene, we thought, why can't they put that 454 in the Camaro? Well, again, the reality of CAFE and the EPA, it wasn't possible, but you have to give Chevy props for trying. And the first year SS 454s were cool, but again, that 3-speed Turbo 400 lacked overdrive. So they came with very mild rear axle ratios, and as a result, weren't that great for acceleration or fuel economy. But as they got into the 1991-92, the 4-speed overdrive of the 4L80 transmission opened a whole new world to SS 454 performance. And again, the extra power of dual exhaust arrived for 1991, giving them extra efficiency on exhaust and adding enough power to lay rubber at both rear tires. Yeah, the SS 454 pickup trucks are surefire collector's items, and in fact today we see them gaining speed and value at the Barrett-Jackson auctions. Okay, that's fact 52. Moving on to fact number 53, let's talk more truck here. Sticking with the SS 454 muscle truck for a moment, the 373-to-1 rear axle ratio used in 1990 was considered pretty radical in its day. So when Chevrolet changed it to 410s in 1991, acceleration was even better and performance fans cheered. The lower ratio, which is actually numerically higher, axle ratio was made possible because General Motors switched from the venerable Turbo 400 3-speed to the all-new 4L80 4-speed overdrive. Inside the 4L80's 2.48-to-1 first gear ratio was unchanged, but the big difference was the 0.75 overdrive fourth gear, which reduced the engine speed. The enhanced highway fuel economy compensated for the stiff gears in the back. It was a win-win for the mighty 454 SS. So, you go back to the 1960s, and most muscle cars came with at least a 320-to-1 axle ratio, maybe a 355. The really hairy stuff was 410s, 488s, 456s. But by the 1990s, because the factories were trying to get engine speeds down to improve fuel economy, 220, 270, 280-to-1 gear ratios were very popular. Yeah, by the 1970s, Detroit automakers started cutting axle ratios, seeking to reduce engine RPM simply as a means to reduce fuel consumption, because every time the crankshaft turns around, well, every piston sucks in some fuel and air. So the fewer times that crank goes around, the fewer times the rear tires make it go around, the fewer amounts of fuel and air are going to get sucked in, so you get better fuel economy. But it was really cool to go from 373s in 1990 to 410s in 1991, 92, and 3. And that 410 ratio is a magical number. Owners of 1969 Z28s will remember that you could get a 410 ratio right from the factory in a Z28. Pretty hairy stuff without overdrive. And picking up, fact number 54, here we go, show 4. Okay, let's move on from 1990s hot rod pickup trucks to Corvairs. Yep, fact 54 tells us about the Corvair. Here we go. If factory-installed multiple carburation transforms an ordinary car into a muscle car, then owners of triple carb 427 Corvettes and dual quad 409 Impalas must bow respectable to any naturally aspirated Corvair. Okay, that's an absurd stretch, but it's a fact. General Motors equipped every Corvair with either 2 or 4 single-barrel carburetors right from the factory. It was the most efficient way to feed the Pancake 6's horizontally opposed cylinders. Ironically, the hottest Corvair engine, the optional turbocharged Monza Spider Mill, was the only Corvair power plant not to feature multiple carburetors. It breathed through one single-barrel YH side draft carburetor. And it's true, engines, of course, naturally aspirated engines, inhale on the intake stroke through a carburetor. The Venturi effect draws in atomized fuel. The fuel and air get sparked off, and you make power. And of course, with good cylinder heads, multiple carburetors like the 427 Tri-Power Corvette or 3-9 GTO Tri-Power or 6-pack Mopar or dual quad race Hemi or any of those great engines we've talked about, the multiple carburetors elevate them into muscle car status. But that's not the case with a quad one-barrel equipped Corvair Pancake 6. They had as little as 110 horsepower. But again, that was the way that Chevrolet efficiently fed each cylinder on that flat 6. I got to say, though, for a car maker like General Motors to watch and cut pennies as much as they do, to pay for 4 Rochester one-barrel carburetors, that was a very brave engineering statement. But again, the hottest Corvair was the single carbureted turbo model. Okay, let's move on from Corvairs to fact number 55, a little talk about engine blocks and main cap fasteners. All right, let's pick it up with number 55, moving from Corvairs to engine block architecture. Though more resistant to the type of brute force that seeks to flush the crankshaft through the oil pan, the real benefit of 4-bolt main bearing caps has to do with controlling the oil clearance between the main bearing and the crankshaft journal. Under the strain of extended periods of full throttle operation, such as endurance racing, standard 2-bolt caps are more likely to deflect. The increased oil clearance leads to cumulative bearing and crank wear that can be delayed or prevented with more rigid 4-bolt main bearing caps. Regular production 4-bolt main caps first appeared on the 65 L78 396 big block. The first fortified small block was the 1967 L48 350. But notable Chevrolet performance models that did not feature 4-bolt main caps include all 348s, all 409s, the 1963 427 Cube Z11 W Series engine, all pre-1967 265, 283, and 327 small blocks, and every pre-1969 Z28 302. So while a lot of folks say, hey, 4-bolt mains, Chevrolet was kind of late to the party. Chrysler had cross-bolted mains in their 426 Hemi in 1964, and then, of course, Ford had 4-bolt mains in the Boss 302 and certain other engines, but Chevrolet, early small blocks, never had 4-bolt mains. But again, you've got to remember, the 4-bolt mains were really there to protect the engine against the changes in the oil film between the bearing and the crank after prolonged stress on a high-speed situation like a road race course or the Daytona 500. So if you build a 350 Chevy, like our friend Chris, our engineering manager, you're building a Corvette right now, and you've got a 2-bolt main 350, I would say don't be afraid of that at all. You're not going to break that at all. Again, the 4-bolt mains are mostly about longevity and prolonging the oil film in the engine block. All right, moving from 4-bolt mains to Chevy 409s and 348s, this is fact number 56. Chevrolet produced roughly 44,000 409-powered passenger cars between 1961 and 1965. In comparison, hundreds of thousands of 348s were made. So how do you tell them apart? Frankly, it's tough. For starters, the 409 dipstick bung is on the passenger side of the oil pan, and most 409 blocks carry the letter X cast in the driver's side front corner. But with the availability of reproduction 409 engine pans, which also fit through 348 blocks, the only foolproof method is disassembly and physical measurement. And one thing too, inside 409 engine blocks, you'll actually find a larger crankcase environment that the 348 blocks don't have. In fact, if you try to put a 409 crankcase or crankshaft into a 348, in many cases the counterweights hit the block and you have to grind on them. So again, you really got to pull those 348s apart to see if it's truly a 348 or maybe a 409 hiding in plain sight. Okay, moving from fact number 56, which is about 348 and 409 engine blocks, let's move on to fact number 57 and jump forward a couple of decades to the world of the Gen 3 Camaro. Okay, number 57 reads, an integral part of the performance recipe that allowed the 1982 Z28's optional LU5 Crossfire injection 305 to deliver 165 horsepower was its functional ram air hood. At the wide end of each blacked-out NACA duct, a vacuum motor lifted a pair of flaps at full throttle to admit cool, dense outside air. Chevrolet almost canceled the functional scoops when development engineers discovered the high-pressure water jets found in some automated car wash stations were strong enough to lift the flaps and flood the engine. Happily, a simple fix was made with the inclusion of a written warning in the owner's manual suggesting hand washing on cold air-equipped Z28s. So that's pretty cool. You know, the Gen 3 Camaro, when it came out in 1982, I think was Motor Trend's Car of the Year. was on all the magazine covers and really was an exotic, radical change from the Gen 2 Camaro, which went from 1970 through 1981. In fact, the Gen 3 Camaro was something like 600 pounds lighter. So even though they didn't have 350 engines, instead 305s were as big as it got, the lower weight helped to make the power-to-weight ratio pretty good. But that's pretty cool that Chevrolet wanted so hard to keep the cold air function, they included a little sentence in your owner's manual. If you didn't read it, well, too bad for you. Moving on, fact number 58. At first, third-generation Camaros didn't have enough power to damage the standard issue 7.5-inch 10-bolt rear axle, which was initially designed for Chevy Monza economy car applications. But as power options grew from strength to strength, in 1987, Chevy turned to its Australian Holden division for durability solutions. All Camaros ordered with the L98 two-import injection 350 and or the 342 G92 performance axle ratio in place of the standard 323 gears. All Camaros ordered with the L98 two-import injection 350 and or 342-to-1 G92 performance axle ratio gears in place of the standard 323s were built with an Australian-sourced Borg-Warner heavy-duty axle assembly. Pluses included an upsized 7.75-inch ring gear, tapered wheel bearings, and a cone-style clutch unit in place of the plate-style posit traction used in the 10-bolt. Visual identification is easy thanks to the Borg-Warner's 9-bolt inspection cover, rubber fill plug, Borg-Warner logo cast into the bottom of the case, and black paint. Lesser Camaro axles came from factory, not painted. I always like to say you build your car from the back to the front if you're talking about a new Z28 or a backyard hot rod, because after all, if the tires spin or the axle breaks, all the power in the world doesn't mean a thing. Well, it's good to know that Chevrolet followed that tradition with the upsized axle. In fact, something that was hinted at in Hot Rod magazine in the mid-1980s was a possible Dana 44 crate axle. I remember reading, I think it was in Post Exchange or one of those parts in Hot Rod where they cover trends and topics. And it said that Chevy dealers were thinking about offering a Dana 44 crate axle. Now, of course, the Dana 44, as we know, has an 8.5-inch ring gear, which is even bigger than the 7 3/4-inch ring gear in the Borg-Warner piece. That 8.5-inch Dana 44 was also used in Corvettes and Jeeps, believe it or not. But it never came to be, as far as I know. The Dana 44, I believe, was sold maybe for a year or so, but never made it on the production line. That would have been cool to see a Dana rear axle in a 87 350 IROC, but never came to be. Okay, moving from the Camaro's rear axle forward to the clutch assembly. This is fact number 59, and we go back to 1969. The MA6 dual clutch of 1969 was the muscle car era's most rugged factory-installed clutch assembly. To eliminate slippage under load, General Motors used two 10-inch clutch discs separated by a steel center plate, a 24-pound flywheel, and a diaphragm-type pressure plate to get 201 square inches of surface area. With nearly twice the area of a stock clutch, 123 square inches, the MA6 easily handled even the hottest L88 427. Records show that 102 Corvette buyers paid a stiff $79 tariff in 1969, though a small number were likely installed in Novas, Camaros, and Chevelles, and some Oldsmobile 442s, before the option was dropped in 1972. Interestingly, the supercharged 2012 ZL1 Camaro features a standard dual-disc clutch, and Chevy marketing papers even make reference to the MA6 of 1969. The circle is complete. Now, it's funny, a lot of folks say, man, two clutches isn't that heavy. Well, you got to remember, they reduced the weight of the pressure plate to 24 pounds from probably 40 or so to compensate for the initial weight, or for the additional weight of the second clutch. And also going from, say, a 12-inch or an 11-inch clutch to a 10-inch, well, that took 1 inch of diameter out of that, allowing them to have a slightly lower positioning of the engine in the vehicle. And the lower you get the engine to the ground, the lower the center of gravity is, and the better the performance will be. All right, moving from manual transmission tech to automatics, we go to fact number 60. General Motors entered the modern age of 3-speed automatic transmission design in 1964 with the introduction of the Turbo-Hydromatic 400, the Turbo 400 we all know and love today. Though the first cars to benefit were built by Cadillac and Buick, 1967 saw its optional availability in Chevy big block muscle cars, except the Corvette, which got it in 1968. Deemed overkill behind 307, 327, and 352 barrel small block engines, in 1969, General Motors whipped up the MC1 Turbo-Hydromatic 350, also a modern 3-speed, as a little brother to the Turbo Hydra 400. But Chevrolet knew the Turbo 350's strength limitations and barred its use behind big blocks or small blocks making 300 horsepower or more. It's true, when I was younger, I remember learning about the Chevy hierarchy. We had the Powerglide, Turbo 350, and a Turbo 400. And Chevy knew it too. Again, the Turbo 350 was never found behind a big block and never behind a small block with more than 300 horsepower. Okay, that was fact number 60, and if you're following along at home reading my Steve Magnanti's 1001 Muscle Car Facts book, you'll see that fact number 61 begins a new chapter. We go from engine and drivetrain to suspension and brakes. And again, these are Chevrolet-themed items. Don't worry, we'll get into the Mopar, the Ford, the Buick, and all that stuff very shortly. But for now, let's go on to fact number 61, Chevelle brakes. Here we go. Regardless of engine size, all 1964 through 66 Chevelles were fitted with 9.5-inch drum brakes. The lone exception was the 396 Big Block Z16 Supersport of 1965, which featured massive 11-inch drum brakes borrowed from the Chevy full-size passenger car line. Only 201 Z16 Chevelles were built. Now, I got to say, I love all muscle cars, but at the core, I'm a Mopar guy. Back in the 80s, that was fighting words. The Chevy guys hated the Mopar guys and all that. But I think as we've gotten into the 21st century, we all kind of get along. We learn from each other. But I remember seeing, Mopars, Roadrunners and stuff. The smallest brakes you get on those things with 11-inch drums all the way around. Big brakes. I remember thinking, man, an SS396, 1966, 7, 8, 9, came with a 9.5-inch drum brake package. The same stuff they put on 6-cylinder Chevelles. And I wondered, how could they do that? Well, the reality is, if you're driving the car normally and you have power brakes, those 9.5-inch drums aren't that bad, especially if you got the metallic brake option. But still, Mopar kind of overdid things with their 11-inch drums. They were heavy, but they surely did work. And in fact, they were borrowed from the police car parts bin. And speaking of parts bins, it's interesting to see that Chevy knew enough to borrow the Z16 Chevelle's brakes from the full-size Impala parts bin in 65, but they chose in 66 to not do that. Interesting stuff. I'm sure that it all came down to the bean counters and keeping the costs under control. Okay, moving from Chevelle brakes to Corvette brakes, and this is a place where Chevrolet really made amends for some of their brake inefficiencies. 62, fact 62 reads, 1965 saw the arrival of standard four-wheel disc brakes on the Corvette Stingray. America's premier performance car finally had brakes to match its acceleration. And so, 23,248 of the 23,564 Stingrays built in 1965 featured beefy 11 3/4-inch rotors squeezed by 4-piston calipers. Wait a minute, what about the other 316 cars? Well, thanks to RPO J61, they were built with leftover 1964 drum brakes, and their buyers received a $64.50 credit. So we have to ask, why would anybody want fade-prone drums over disc brakes? Because cast iron rotors and calipers are several pounds heavier than stamped steel drums, it is possible some of the J61 cars went to weight-conscious drag racers. Chevrolet may also have simply been building out remaining drum brake parts just to get rid of them. So it is kind of weird. I've seen a couple of these cars cross the block at Barrett-Jackson, and again, these are 1965 J61 drum brake Stingrays, and they don't bring more money, but they certainly, the folks selling those cars make a big thing saying drum brake 65, and it is pretty cool. I think I wouldn't mind. I don't think you'd really know the difference between a disc and a drum brake Stingray if you're driving the car normally. But again, the weight difference on those two brake systems was pretty significant, so I can see where a 1965 drag racer might want those lightweight drums up front and in back instead of the heavier discs. I get it. All right, moving from the world of Corvette disc brakes to Chevelle axles, we go to fact number 63, which reads, Chevelle rear axle spotters had something new to look for in 1968, a rear sway bar positioned beneath the axle housing, very visible to trained eyes as it passed on the street. As part of the F41 heavy-duty suspension standard on every SS396 Chevelle, a similar sight greeted Olds 442 rear suspension spotters since 1964. You've got to remember, of course, that the Chevelle SS396 was not the first GM A-body muscle car. That would have been the GTO of 1964 and followed very shortly, halfway into 64, by the Olds 442. Now, Oldsmobile, to set itself apart from its GM stablemates, focused on suspension and handling, and yes, every Olds 442 from 1964 on up came with the rear sway bar. and it looks like a rod, which goes from one coil spring control arm under the axle to the other coil spring control arm, and thus you can tell an Olds 442 from a mile away if you're behind it in traffic. But after 1968, you could also see the same stuff on Chevelle SS396s. Okay, that's the story on Olds 442 and Chevelle SS396 sway bars. Let's move on to wheels and their applications on Chevelle with fact number 64. It goes, the first Chevelle SS fitted with 15-inch wheels arrived in 1971 and used the same wide-spoke wheels as on the 70 Camaro Z28. All previous high-performance Chevelles, even the 1965 Z16 SS396 with its 11-inch drum brakes, rolled on 14-inch rims. Unlike the 14-inch motor wheel sourced 1969-1970 rally wheels, which were still attractive without trim rings, removing the trim rings on the restyled 15-inch wheels revealed an ungainly gap. But when used as intended, with the wide-spoke 15-inch SS wheels and meaty F60-15 tires looked great. Too bad they arrived just as the party was ending. It's true, 15-inch wheels were commonly available on Ford and Mopar performance cars, but GM stuck with 14s kind of right to the end. The only 15s available on Chevys were on Camaros and Corvettes. Chevelle's 14 inches until 71. And it is kind of weird. If you ever see one of these wheels, if you imagine a 1970 Z28 with the factory SS-type wheel, that chrome ring on the outside, that thing comes off. And if you take it off, there's an inch-wide gap. You can stick your thumb in. It looks really weird. That same wheel was made optional in 1971 on Chevelles. And again, in 1973, when the Colonnade style body took over, the 15-inch wheel option remained. But again, under the hood, after 1971, the party was over. Okay, moving on to some leaf spring technology, we go to fact 65. The 1962 Chevy Nova rode on unique monoleaf rear springs, which were adopted along with certain cowl height dimensions by the 1967 Camaro, although Camaro springs were 6.5 inches shorter. Late in the Camaro chassis development program, its monoplate springs were found to be incapable of controlling axle windup on hard acceleration. A crutch was devised in the form of a single traction bar spanning the passenger side axle tube and subframe. Multi-leaf rear springs arrived in 1968 on all Camaros with 300 horsepower or more, as did staggered shock absorber mounts. So it's true, while the Camaro was all new in 67, it kind of wasn't. It shared a lot of its underpinnings with the Chevy Nova, including that monoplate rear springs. And in 1967, even the beefiest L78 SS396 Camaro came with monoplate rear springs. And again, on the proving grounds, they often found wide open acceleration unleashed a world of axle hop. An axle hop is basically a thing where the tire makes and breaks contact with the pavement like once a second, bouncing, banging up and down. And every time you shift a gear, second, third, fourth, that hopping continues and even gets more violent. So they found a part-time crutch to that with the traction arm in 1967, and by going to multi-plate springs in 68 onward in 300 horsepower applications. But again, those monoplate springs were a marvel of cost-cutting, but not so good for performance. Okay, moving from Camaro leaf spring tech to some brake techs, we go on to fact number 66. 1967 and 68 Camaros ordered with the optional J52 or J56 front disc brakes used cast iron 4-piston brake calipers. For 1969, Camaros got a new cast iron single-piston front disc brake caliper designed except when equipped with JL8 4-wheel disc brakes. JL8 cars continued to use Corvette-sourced 4-piston brake calipers. A total of 208 JL8 Camaros were built, the option adding a hefty $500 to the window sticker. So if you have a 67 or 68 Camaro and you're looking for front brake calipers, you're looking for 4-piston calipers. And to wrap it up, for 69, GM went to a single piston caliper in 69 on the Camaro, except for those 206 cars built with 4-wheel disc brakes. In that case, again, you're going backwards looking for 4-piston calipers, but not from Camaros, from Corvettes. It's complicated. Pay attention. That's it for episode number 4 of the Steve Maggs Muscle Car Show. We'll be back next Wednesday with a whole new show packed with Chevy muscle car facts. In the mix, we'll explore the Monte Carlo SS 454, 57 Chevy Black Widow, and tell you why spare wheels had to come from Chevy pickup trucks. For my executive engineer, Chris Roberts, I'm Steve Magg saying hasta mañana. The Steve Magg's Muscle Car Show podcast is brought to you by High Octane Classics, the Northeast's largest muscle car and supercar dealership, located at 143 Washington Street in Auburn, Massachusetts. High Octane Classics buys and sells and services muscle cars and exotics. Call them at 508-859-4515.